When I opened the front door, Eleanor was standing beside a small overnight bag, and our son was blocking the hallway like he had been waiting for me to come home. Her house key sat alone on the entry table. "What happened?" I asked. Eleanor looked at Daniel before she looked at me. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Your son says I should stay somewhere else tonight." Daniel folded his arms. I said if Mom can't respect how things are being run now, maybe she needs some space. For a second, I thought I had walked into an argument that had gotten louder than either of them intended. Daniel and his family had been staying with us for months, and tensions over repairs, rooms, and expenses had been building. But this was still our home. "Daniel," I said, put her key back in her hand. He didn't move. "Dad, you're acting like this came out of nowhere. You put me in charge of this house." That sentence stopped me, not because it was true, because I recognized the language. Months earlier, while I was recovering from surgery, I had signed paperwork allowing Daniel to handle certain repairs and deal with contractors for me. I had spent 38 years in residential construction. I knew the difference between giving someone authority over a job and giving them authority over a property. Apparently, Daniel had decided there was no difference at all. Eleanor picked up her bag. "I'm not standing here asking my own son for permission to sleep in my own bedroom." "Mom, nobody said that. You put my key on the table." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because every decision turns into a fight with you." I looked at him. "And your answer was to tell your mother to leave?" He glanced toward the living room, where I could see boxes that had not been there that morning. "My answer was to stop pretending this arrangement can work if nobody respects who's responsible now." There it was again. Responsible. In charge. Arrangement. Words close enough to something official to sound convincing if nobody asked what they actually meant. I wanted to challenge him right there. Part of me wanted to walk past him, pick up Eleanor's key, and tell him exactly whose name was on the house. But Eleanor was trembling. Not much, just enough that I noticed because I had known her for 41 years. Turning that hallway into a shouting match would not give her dignity back. It would only make Daniel push harder. I picked up her overnight bag. I left the key exactly where Daniel had placed it. "Dad," he said, "we're leaving for tonight," I told him. Relief crossed his face so quickly that I almost missed it. He thought I was giving in. Eleanor and I drove to a small motel 20 minutes away. She barely spoke on the way. After she fell quiet beside the window, I opened the document case I still kept with my old contracting files. I knew exactly what I was looking for. And when I found the copy with Daniel's name on it, I understood how he had convinced himself the house was his to control. The document was exactly where I remembered putting it, behind an old folder of estimates and warranty papers. I read it once, then again more slowly. Months earlier, after my surgery, I had needed someone to handle the repairs I could not supervise myself. Daniel was already living with us with his family while they worked through financial problems, so letting him coordinate the work had seemed practical. The authorization allowed him to schedule contractors, provide access to the property, communicate about approved repairs, and sign off on work within the budget Eleanor and I had already established. It did not transfer the house. It did not make him an owner. It certainly did not give him the right to decide whether Eleanor could live there. After 38 years as a residential contractor, I had learned one rule that saved more arguments than any handshake ever could. When people disagreed about what had been agreed to, you went back to the paper. Memory could bend. Paper usually did not. I placed the document on the motel desk. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the clothes she had left home in. "So," she asked, "he has authority over the repair work we approved." Nothing more. She looked at the pages but did not reach for them. "Then why are we sitting here?" It was a fair question, and I did not have an answer that made me look particularly good. Because walking back in tonight and waving this at him won't solve everything. It would prove he's wrong. To us, yes. But if he has a different copy, or if he's been telling people I gave him more authority verbally, it becomes my paper against whatever story he's already built. Eleanor studied me. "You still think this is about a misunderstanding?" I started to answer, then stopped. "I think I need to know how far he's taken it." Her expression changed, not anger exactly, but exhaustion. "Robert, he put my key on a table and told me to leave." I looked down at the document. "I know." "Do you?" she asked quietly. "Because you've been giving him room for months. Every time he changed something, you said he was trying to help. Every time he pushed, you said he was under pressure. That landed harder than I wanted it to." I had thought patience would give our son time to get back on his feet. Maybe I had confused patience with avoiding a confrontation I should have had earlier. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated on the desk. Then it vibrated again. The first message was from my sister Margaret. The second came from another relative. Both asked some version of the same question. Why had Eleanor walked out when Daniel's family needed stability? I showed the screen to her. She read the messages and handed the phone back without saying anything. Daniel had not waited for morning. While we were sitting in a motel because he had ordered his mother out of her own home, he was already telling the family that she had chosen to leave. By breakfast, Daniel's version of the night had traveled farther than we had. According to the messages coming into my phone, Eleanor had become upset over changes in the house, refused to cooperate, and decided to leave. I had supposedly gone with her to calm her down. Daniel had also told people that I had put him in charge months ago, which made everything else sound almost reasonable if you did not know what I had actually signed. That was the dangerous part. There was enough truth inside his story to make the rest believable. He had coordinated repairs. Contractors had called him. He had been present when work was done. To relatives who had only seen pieces of the arrangement, Daniel looked like the person managing the property because, for a while, that was exactly what I had authorized him to do. I did not answer the family messages. Instead, I opened my old contacts and called 2 contractors who had worked on the house during that period. I did not tell either man about Daniel throwing Eleanor out. I did not ask anyone to choose sides. I simply asked whether they still had the emails and invoices from our jobs and whether they could send me copies for my records. Both did. I sat at the motel desk while the messages arrived and read through them in order. Daniel's name appeared often, but so did the limits of his role. One contractor had written, Daniel is the owner's authorized project contact for scheduling. Another invoice listed Eleanor and me as the clients while Daniel was identified as the site contact. Small distinctions, perhaps, until someone tried to turn project responsibility into ownership. Eleanor stood behind me reading over my shoulder. So now you have proof from people who aren't us. I have enough to show he's describing his authority differently from everyone who actually worked under it. I could have photographed every page and dropped them into the family group chat. For about 30 seconds, I wanted to. But public embarrassment would be difficult to undo, and I still wanted to know whether Daniel would step away from the edge if I gave him the chance privately. I called him. I want Mom's key returned, I said when he answered. I want her back in the house without conditions. And I want you to stop telling people I gave you control of the property. If you do those things, we can sit down privately and work out what happens next. He was silent for a moment. So you're taking her side. There shouldn't be sides to whether your mother is allowed inside her own home. You don't understand what it's been like trying to keep that place functioning. I understand exactly what I authorized you to do. His voice hardened. You put me in charge, Dad, of specific work. You can call it whatever you want now. I looked at the contractor emails on the desk. Daniel, I'm giving you a chance to correct this before it becomes something bigger. He exhaled sharply. No, the house is finally being managed properly. I'm not going backward because Mom doesn't like that. Then, almost casually, he added, I'm having everyone over tomorrow so we can clear this up once and for all. They should understand the arrangement from the person who actually has to manage it. After he hung up, I kept the phone in my hand for several seconds. Eleanor did not ask what he had said. She had heard enough from my side of the conversation. Until that moment, I had been trying to determine whether Daniel had misunderstood a document. Now I understood the larger problem. He was preparing to make his version of our family's reality permanent, and he wanted witnesses when he did it. After Daniel's call, I stopped thinking of the next day as a family discussion and started thinking about what had to be clear before we walked into it. Eleanor still needed her medication and several personal things from the house, so we went back while Daniel was away. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed changes I had not seen the night before. My small home office, the room where I had kept estimates, tax folders, and 38 years of accumulated business records, had been cleared for Daniel's household. Several of my boxes had been moved into the garage. Nothing was smashed. Nothing was missing that I could see. Somehow that made it worse. Daniel had moved my things with the confidence of someone who no longer believed he needed to ask. Eleanor went to the bedroom while I opened the boxes in the garage. Near the bottom of one was an old folder from the renovation. Inside were the original scope of work invoices, and correspondence connected to the authorization I had given Daniel. I spread the papers across a workbench and reconstructed the sequence the same way I used to reconstruct a disputed job: what had been approved, who had authority to request changes, and who had final approval. Then I found something I had almost forgotten. During the repairs, Daniel had requested a change that went beyond the approved scope. The contractor had rejected it until either Eleanor or I approved it as the owners. The email was months old. It had been written long before our current argument, which meant nobody could claim I had created it to win a family dispute. I took a copy with me. Before leaving, I sent Daniel a photograph of that single email. I did not send the rest. Under it I wrote, "Read this carefully. This is what being authorized to manage the work meant. You still have time to correct what happened." His response came before Eleanor had finished gathering her things. "Paperwork doesn't change what you told me. You basically gave me the house." I read the sentence twice. Until then, I could still imagine that Daniel had confused responsibility with authority. Now he was admitting something different. He knew the paperwork had limits. He simply believed months of access and responsibility had entitled him to move beyond them. Eleanor came down the hallway carrying a small bag. She saw the expression on my face. He answered. I handed her the phone. She read his message and returned it. "You keep giving him chances. I want to know I gave him every reasonable chance before I do something we can't easily undo." She nodded, but there was sadness in it. We walked toward the front door. Then she stopped beside the entry table. The place where her key had been the night before was empty. She checked the surface, then the small bowl where we sometimes left spare keys. Nothing. Robert. I already knew what she was showing me. Daniel had not simply left her key where he had placed it. Sometime after we walked out, he had taken it. I looked at the empty table and felt the argument change again. He was no longer just claiming authority in words. He was beginning to behave as though his interpretation had already become fact. On the drive back to the motel, Eleanor said almost nothing. I knew better than to mistake silence for calm. When we reached the room, she put her bag down and finally turned to me. "Do you know how long this has been happening? Daniel taking over? Daniel deciding what I'm allowed to decide in my own house." I did not answer quickly enough. "Weeks, Robert. He moved things without asking. He changed household plans after I'd already made them. When I objected, he said you wanted him handling things now." She sat down. "And every time I thought about telling you how bad it was getting, I remembered how worried you were about him. About his finances. About the children having somewhere stable to stay. I felt something in me sink. I had seen individual incidents and treated each one as temporary. Daniel was under pressure. Daniel was trying to help. Daniel needed a little room to recover. I had thought I was preventing unnecessary conflict. Instead, my silence had given him something useful, the appearance that I agreed with him. "You should have told me," I said, and regretted it immediately. Eleanor looked at me. "I'm telling you now. You're right." I sat beside her. "I should have seen it before you had to." My phone rang. "Daniel." I answered. His tone was calmer than it had been earlier, which somehow made the conversation worse. "I've been thinking," he said. "Mom can come back." I looked at Eleanor. "Without conditions?" "There has to be one condition. She needs to apologize for how she handled this, and she needs to accept that I'm making the major house decisions now. Otherwise, we'll be right back where we started." I felt whatever uncertainty remained disappear. "No, Dad, your mother does not apologize for being thrown out of her own home. That's not what happened. Her key disappeared after you told her to leave." He went quiet. I continued. "And you do not make the major decisions about our house. You're really going to blow up the family over this. I'm trying to stop you from doing exactly that." When the call ended, I opened my document case again. This time I was not looking for another clue. I was making a decision. I wrote Daniel formal notice that the temporary authority I had given him to coordinate property work was revoked. Effective immediately, he was no longer authorized to act for Eleanor or me in matters involving the house. I sent it in writing so there could be no argument later about what I had said. I did not tell him to pack that night. His children were living there too, and I was not going to turn their lives upside down simply to prove I could. But the arrangement that had allowed Daniel to present himself as our representative was over. A few minutes later, Margaret called. "Robert," she said carefully, "something about Daniel's version doesn't make sense." She had noticed that he kept saying I had given him the house, while also describing himself as the person managing it for us. She wanted to know what was actually happening. Come tomorrow, I told her. Listen to what Daniel says. That's all I'm asking. I did not need her recruited to my side. I needed everyone hearing the same facts. That evening, Daniel sent a message to the family confirming the meeting would still happen at our house. Then he added one sentence clearly meant for me. I'll bring the document Dad signed so everyone can see the truth. Eleanor read it over my shoulder. I looked at the authorization in front of me. Daniel was about to stake his entire story on the one piece of paper that had never said what he claimed it did. By the next morning, Daniel had already begun circulating his proof. Margaret forwarded me a photograph he had sent to several relatives. It showed the top portion of the authorization, including my signature and phrases like authorized representative and property management. What it did not show was the language underneath defining exactly what Daniel had been authorized to manage. Taken alone, the photograph looked stronger than his argument actually was. My phone started ringing. One relative asked whether I had changed my mind after giving Daniel responsibility for the house. Another suggested Eleanor and I should settle things quietly rather than embarrass everyone. Daniel's version was working because he was showing people just enough truth to make his conclusion seem reasonable. Eleanor watched me silence another call. Why don't you send them the whole document? She asked. Because then Daniel answers with another explanation, and we spend the day arguing page by page through messages. I placed his photograph beside my complete copy. Tomorrow he can say I sent a different version, or that everyone misunderstood him. Tonight, everyone sees the same papers at the same time. I requested the current property record I needed and added it to the documents already in my folder. Then I arranged everything chronologically. The original authorization, the approved repair scope, contractor correspondence, the rejected change request, and the ownership record. It was the same habit I had used for decades when a construction dispute became more complicated than it needed to be. Start with what was agreed to. Follow what happened afterward. Never ask a document to prove more than it actually proved. Eleanor had been quiet for several minutes. Finally, she said, I don't think I can go. I looked up. To the meeting? She nodded. I don't want to sit in my own living room while Daniel explains to everyone why I deserve to be put out of it. I closed the folder. Then we don't do it that way. She looked surprised. I can handle this privately. I can cancel the meeting if that's what you need. And Daniel? Daniel will still hear what happens next. But you don't owe anyone an audience for your humiliation. Eleanor looked toward the window. If I don't go, he'll tell them I was afraid to face him. Let him. I'm not asking you to prove anything. She was silent for a long moment. Then she stood. No, I'm going. I did not try to persuade her either way. That decision had to belong to her. I picked up the folder. There was something else I had finally accepted too. Once I contradicted Daniel in front of the family, I could not protect him from the embarrassment created by his own claims. He might see that as betrayal. He might stop speaking to me. For months, I had allowed the fear of damaging my relationship with my son to influence how much I tolerated. Eleanor had paid part of that price without my realizing it. I would not ask her to pay it again. As we prepared to leave, she touched the folder under my arm. And if he sees all of that and still won't leave? I looked at her. Then he'll finally hear the boundary I should have given him months ago. Daniel opened the front door before I could use the bell. He looked at Eleanor first, then at the folder under my arm. Everyone's. Already here, he said. He stepped aside, and we walked into our own house like guests. Margaret was in the living room with several relatives. Daniel stood near the center of the room, comfortable in the space, speaking with the confidence of a man who believed possession had already settled the argument. I sat beside Eleanor and let him begin. I didn't want this to become a family issue, he said, but Mom made it one when she refused to accept the arrangement Dad put in place. He explained that I had given him responsibility for managing the property months earlier. According to him, Eleanor had resisted necessary changes, created constant conflict, and finally chosen to leave when he insisted the house needed one person making decisions. Then he held up the document. I recognized my signature from across the room. This is what Dad signed. A relative glanced at me. Another looked toward Eleanor. Daniel pointed to the same phrases he had photographed that morning. Authorized representative. Property management. I didn't invent this. Technically, he was right. Those words were there. For a few moments, I could feel the room settling around his version. He had the house. He had my signature. Eleanor and I were the ones who had left. If someone knew nothing else, Daniel's story had a shape that was easy to believe. Then Then he looked directly at his mother. The real problem is that Mom couldn't accept that the house needed new leadership. Eleanor's hand tightened beside mine. That was the moment Daniel still could have stopped. I stood and placed my folder on the table. Daniel, before you go any further, do you want to read the complete authorization? His expression hardened. I've read it. Then read the section that defines the scope of your authority. Dad, don't do this. I'm asking you one question. He held up the document again. You signed this. You can't rewrite history because Mom got upset. Nobody spoke. Daniel had been offered every private opportunity one knew how to give him, and now, in front of the same people he had invited to validate his story, he had chosen to double down. All right, I said. Show everyone where it says you own this house. His eyes dropped to the page. That's not what I said. Then show them where it says you decide who is allowed to live here. He flipped through the pages once, then again. It gives me management authority. Over what? He did not answer. I opened my folder and placed my complete copy beside his. Read the scope. Margaret leaned forward. Daniel stared at the paragraph, but said nothing. I did not need to raise my voice. I took out the next page and laid it on the table. The contractor email from months earlier rejecting one of Daniel's requested changes because it required approval from the owners. I turned it so everyone could read it. This was written while Daniel was supposedly in charge, I said, long before any of us were arguing about what that meant. For the first time since we entered the house, Daniel stopped looking like the host. He looked at the email, then at the folder still under my hand, and he understood there was more inside it. Daniel stared at the contractor email for several seconds before looking back at me. That was one change, he said. It doesn't erase everything else. I agree. I took out the original authorization and placed it beside the email. So let's not erase anything. I read only the relevant section. Daniel had been authorized to coordinate specified repairs, communicate with contractors, provide access, and approve work within the budget Eleanor and I had established. Then I put down the original repair scope. That was the work. Next came the contractor correspondence identifying Daniel as the owner's authorized project contact. That was his role. I pointed to the rejected change request already on the table. And when he tried to approve something outside that role, the contractor required permission from the owners. Finally, I placed the current property record in front of everyone. Eleanor's name was there beside mine. Daniel's was not. The room became very quiet. You told me the house would be mine someday, Daniel said. We talked about what might happen someday, I replied. That isn't the same as giving it to you now. I put months into this place. You did. I've never denied that. I dealt with contractors. I handled problems you couldn't handle after surgery. You helped when I needed help, and I trusted you with that responsibility. His face tightened. Then you can't stand there and pretend I had no authority. I'm not pretending that. You had authority. It had limits. I tapped the authorization. These limits. Daniel looked around the room as though someone might interrupt me. Nobody did. You left, he said finally. Both of you walked out. Eleanor shifted beside me, but I answered before she could. We left because I would not turn a hallway argument into something uglier while your mother was standing there with a bag in her hand. Leaving for one night did not give you our house. I was trying to protect my family. So was I. I let that sit for a moment. The difference is that protecting yours did not require taking control of ours. Margaret picked up the contractor email. Daniel, if you really believed you owned the house, why did you need Robert or Eleanor to approve this? Daniel looked at her, then at the paper. Because Dad hadn't finished transferring everything. There was no transfer, I said. There was an authorization, and you expanded it in your own mind until helping with this house became controlling it. His eyes moved toward Eleanor. This wouldn't have happened if Mom hadn't fought me on every decision. No, I said. This decision is mine. Do not put it on your mother. That changed something in his expression. For months, I had left enough space between Eleanor and me for Daniel to tell himself she was the obstacle. I closed that space. I took out the written notice I had already sent him. Your authority to act for us regarding this property has been revoked. You no longer contact contractors, approve work, or represent yourself as managing this house for us. Daniel gave a short, bitter laugh. So what now? You throw my kids onto the street. No, your children will not be punished because you crossed a line. I kept my voice level. You'll have a reasonable, fixed period to arrange another place for your family. Until then, you live here as our guest. You do not control this property, and you do not decide whether Eleanor belongs in it. He stared at me. You're choosing her over your own son. She is my wife, Daniel, and this is her home. You forced a choice that never should have existed. Nobody celebrated. Nobody needed to. The papers stayed on the table, plain and almost boring, which was exactly why they mattered. Daniel had not forged my signature or invented a document. He had taken a limited responsibility, stretched it into entitlement, and counted on nobody reading where the responsibility ended. Eleanor stood. I'm going to get a few things from our room. Daniel instinctively moved toward the hallway, then stopped. For the first time since this began, he looked at his mother and asked, "Do you want me to come in?" Eleanor met his eyes. No, Daniel stepped aside, and Eleanor walked past him into her own bedroom without asking anyone's permission. Daniel did not apologize that night, and I did not ask him to. Some things become smaller when people rush to cover them with words. Over the next few weeks, our conversations were mostly practical. Daniel and his family needed time to find another place, and I kept the deadline I had given him. I also made sure the children were not treated as though they had caused any of this. They had not. Daniel was angry with me for most of that period. I could live with his anger more easily than I could live with asking Eleanor to surrender another piece of her home just to keep him comfortable. When moving day finally came, there was no dramatic confrontation. Boxes went out. Rooms emptied. The authority Daniel had once treated as permanent disappeared with the responsibilities that had created it. He returned the keys he still had, and after his family left, the house felt strangely quiet. Eleanor and I did not pretend everything was repaired simply because Daniel was gone. My relationship with my son had changed. So had my understanding of my own part in what had happened. I had spent months believing that patience was helping him recover. In reality, every boundary I postponed had become another space Daniel felt free to occupy. A few weeks later, he sent me a short message. There was no long apology and no request to move back. He wrote that somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that because he was helping with the house was becoming his. I read the message twice before showing Eleanor. "Are you going to answer?" she asked. "Yes, just not by pretending everything is fixed." She nodded. That was enough for both of us. We could leave room for Daniel to become someone we trusted again without handing him the same access he had abused. Later that week, after all his keys had been returned, I had the locks changed. When the locksmith finished, he placed 2 new keys in my palm. I stood outside our front door with Eleanor beside me and thought about the night this had started. Daniel had placed her old key on the entry table as though he had acquired the right to decide whether she needed it. I held out the first new key to her. Eleanor looked at it, then at me. "You do it," I said. She took the key. "The paperwork wasn't the part that mattered most to me," she said quietly. "I know. It was knowing that when you finally had to choose, you weren't going to ask me to keep paying for peace with him. There was nothing useful I could add to that." She was right. Daniel had believed my silence meant agreement. I had believed avoiding a fight meant protecting the family. We had both learned where those assumptions ended. Eleanor slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened. I did not step ahead of her or reach around to hold it, as though I were letting her inside. She opened her own front door, walked into her own home, and I followed her in.